welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part number 8 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about Revelation chapter 12, which is Israel in the wilderness. Now, we've been talking about the simplified version of the Revelation timeline. Second line down, the 7 seals represent the releasing of horse forces, and this plays out over 2,000 years. The third line down represents the 7 trumpets, or the 7 shofars. And this is symbolic of 7-year period of tribulation. And the second half, or the last 3.5 years, is what's called the time of Jacob's trouble. Now, at the end of the time of Jacob's trouble, at the end of this 7-year period, this is when Mystery Babylon is judged, and Babylon begins to fall, and the kingdom is then handed to the saints. And after this, in the sequence, comes insert chapters 12, 13, and 14. And so in this particular set, we're going to talk about Revelation chapter 12, which is the woman Israel in the wilderness. So Revelation chapter 12 and verse 1 says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, and a woman who represents Miriam, but also Israel in context, who's clothed with the sun, symbolic of Yeshua's spirit, and with the moon, or the Torah, under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars," which is symbolic or referring to the lost, not the lost, but symbolic of the 12 tribes. "Then being with child," we're referring to Yeshua, this is a first century event, "she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." And what we see is there's a lot of people who want to turn this into something to do with a rapture or a place of safety. They do things with Basra and Petra and Jordan, but these are really not necessary because this was fulfilled in the first century. So continuing on in verse 3, it says, "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon," referring to Satan or Rome. And again, these are in heaven, so it's all highly symbolic. It says, "having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads." Now, this is a Roman Draco, or a Roman dragon. They're typically red or purple, and the Roman legions would take these with them when they went into battle. So this is one reason that we know that Rome is symbolic of the dragon, or rather the dragon is symbolic of Rome. Verse 4, "And his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth." And a lot of scholars tell us this is referring to what's called Satan's rebellion. And this is when Satan rose up in pride and arrogance and led 1/3 of the messengers, or 1/3 of the angels of heaven, to rebel against Yahweh. It says, "And the dragon," Rome, "stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born." So we can see this 2 ways. We can see both Yeshua and also Israel. Verse 5, "And she bore a male child." Now, this is a first century fulfillment. It's Yeshua, but again, we are his body, Israel. So we're Yeshua's body. But it says here, "She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron." We saw that in Psalms chapter 2 in the last slide set. And we know, of course, from Revelation 2 and verse 26, that Yeshua is going to hand this rod of iron to his body, Israel, who will rule and reign in his stead during his absence. But here it says, "And her child was caught up to Elohim and to his throne." Now, this is obviously clearly a reference to the first century, because Yeshua was born of Miriam, and then Rome was in those days, and Yeshua was caught up to Elohim and to his throne. Verse 6, and it says, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by Elohim, that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. And what we're going to see is that this represents the 1,260 days that the Catholic Church oppressed what would later become the Protestant peoples in Protestant Northwestern Europe. So this doesn't require a rapture theory or a place of safety theory. It just simply involves understanding the history. So to recap, and we cover this in the Nazarene Israel study, in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire invaded the land of Israel, and they took, as we cover in the Nazarene Israel study, they took the northern kingdom of Ephraim, also called the kingdom of Israel, or it's the house of Joseph. They took those into captivity in Assyria. But they also took the majority of the 2 tribes in the southern kingdom. However, they didn't take the headquarters, they didn't take the capital of the southern kingdom, Jerusalem. They only took the capital of the northern kingdom of Ephraim, which was Samaria. So when the tribes were there in Assyria, they effectively forgot their identities and they assimilated and became Assyrians. Now, as studies done by researchers such as Stephen Collins and Yair Davidian, etc., what happened is that when the Assyrian Empire broke up or fragmented, the former citizens of the Assyrian Empire, with the most characteristics that match the prophecies over Israel, were to be found in the north and west section of this empire. Then another empire would grow and take those, they would become part of the new empire. And then when that empire would break up, once again, the Ephraimites or the Israelites, those with the most characteristics matching the prophecies, would be found progressively farther and farther north and west. So that over time, then the children of Israel came to be found within what today we would have called Protestant northwestern Europe. And then they were given into the little horn's hand in accordance with Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25 for a time, times, and half a time, or 1,260 years, as we've explained in other places before. So in verse 7 it says, "And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his messengers fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his messengers fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, and he was cast to the earth, and his messengers were cast out with him." We believe this corresponds again to the first century, for in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, Yeshua said, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." And this took place during the first century, during the Roman occupation. Verse 10, "Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our Elohim and the power of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our Elohim day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives unto the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. And woe to the inhabitants of the earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time.'" Now when the dragon saw that he'd been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman, in this case referring to Israel, who gave birth to the male child. And this can refer to the extreme persecution that went on under some of the early Roman emperors, such as Nero and Diocletian and so forth. Continuing in verse 14, it says, "But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place," which, as we saw, was northwestern Europe, "where she's nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent," or the dragon. And just as a note, if your heritage is not from Protestant northwestern Europe, that's not what is important here. What all we're speaking of in terms of Protestant northwestern Europe is there's a certain history, a certain mechanical aspect of how the prophecies were carried out. But we know from other places in our studies that the Ephraimites and the Israelites will come from east and from west and from every family, every nation, and from every clan. So again, this is simply explaining the history of how these things took place. But we talk about the 2 wings of an eagle. So the Roman war machine, not only did they have the Roman Draco or the Roman dragons, but they also had the Roman war eagles or their flags. And this, again, we talk in other places about how America is an extension of the Roman Empire. And so you can compare it to the American eagle as well. But one of the things, so typically the farther one was from Rome, the easier it was to follow the religion of the Bible, or you could follow Scripture, as opposed to following the religion of the Pope. And so there were various groups that followed the Bible, And this would, including the Waldenses, the Vaudois. There was also John Wycliffe in England and Martin Luther in Germany. And the reason that these people were able to practice their faith is that they were at a distance from Rome. So physical separation from Rome, also spiritual separation from Rome, gave a kind of safety. Now we want to delve into this a little bit more, and we want to talk about Daniel chapter 7. But before we talk about Daniel chapter 7, first we want to talk about Daniel chapter 2, because there's a very strong relation. There's a one-to-one correlation between the empire series that's shown in Daniel chapter 2 and the one we're going to see in Daniel chapter 7. So in Daniel chapter 2, we saw that King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, dreamt of a series of empires, dreamt of a statue that was set up on the earth in 5 parts. And the first 4 parts of this statue represented a series of spiritual empires. And then the 5th empire was a spiritual extension of the 4th empire. Now what happens is when we get into Daniel chapter 7, the spiritual extension of the 4th empire is just all included into the 4th empire. So in other words, instead of listing 5 empires in Daniel chapter 2, in Daniel chapter 7, it only lists 4 empires, but 4 and 5 in Daniel 2 are the same as 4 in Daniel 7. So for example, in the Babylonian Empire shows up as the head of gold in Daniel 2, and in Daniel 7 it's a lion. The Medo-Persian Empire is represented by the chest and arms of silver in Daniel 2, and in Daniel 7 it's represented by a bear. The Macedonian Empire, Alexander the Great's Macedonian or Greek Empire, is the belly and thighs of bronze. And in Daniel 7, it shows up as a leopard with wings. And then Rome shows up as the 2 legs of iron in Daniel 2. In Daniel 2, there's also 2 feet of iron mixed with clay, which is the spiritual extension. But they all show up in Daniel 7 simply as the 4th empire, which is a great beast with iron teeth and bronze nails. Remembering that Greece or Macedonia was the belly and thighs of bronze. And we're going to see how all that ties together. We're also going to see some very important correlations between the belly and thighs of bronze of Greece or Macedonia and the Islamic clay. We're going to see that those 2 things basically run together. So let's dive in. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 2. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, which is the Mediterranean. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. And again, these beasts refer to the series of 4 empires. Verse 4. The first, Babylon, was like a lion, meaning it was very powerful. And it had eagle's wings, which means it spread very rapidly. And I watched until its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, which was Medo-Persia, because it was very powerful, but it was also slow to move. It was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said to it, thus, arise, devour much flesh. And after this I looked, and there was another, which refers to Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, because it spread so very rapidly. And I've always been amazed how fast Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire spread. So here we have a picture of, and this all took place in 4 years. So we see Rome in the upper left-hand corner of the Italian peninsula. And then just to the right or to the east of that lies Macedonia. Macedonia is just a little bit to the north of Greece. But now notice, Alexander the Great's empire stretched then heading eastward through Turkey and Syria, Iraq, then Iran, Afghanistan, and then Pakistan, up to the border of what we know of today as India. It also stretched down into Egypt. Now, this was Alexander the Great's bronze, belly and thighs of bronze. But notice that today, all of these nations, of course, with the notable exception of Israel, all of these nations are Islamic. So what we see then is that the bronze turns into Islam, into miry clay. And there's some important clues that we're going to see throughout the narrative here. So if we come to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7, it says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast," referring to Rome, "dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth," and we know that iron refers to Rome. "It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet." Very important phrase, trampling the residue with its feet, because what this means is that the fourth empire would trample the residue of all of the other empires underneath its feet. Well, so how is it going to do this? So let's take a look. This is a depiction of the Roman Empire at its height, or this is the farthest extent of the Roman Empire, the Empire of Iron. Now notice we have Rome, again on the Italian peninsula, and then Macedonia, which is right above Greece. But the Roman Empire was basically a Mediterranean phenomenon. And then it also extended somewhat to the north and west. But as we saw 2 slides ago, Macedonia, that empire extended all the way to the east through Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, places that the Roman Empire never went. So this is how we know that the Roman Empire it's another hint that we have that the Roman Empire is going to team up with cousin Ishmael. And we know that Esau intermarried with Ishmael's clan, because this is how Esau and Ishmael are going to trample the residue underneath their feet. Even though the Roman Empire never covered these territories, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, they're going to work together and thus trample the residue. So continuing in Daniel 7 and verse 7, it says, "It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." And as we saw before in Daniel chapter 2, this refers to 10 kingships, which corresponds to the 10 toes of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. Verse 19, he says, "Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its 2 feet." So once again, now we have nails of bronze, even though it doesn't extend all the way where Alexander the Great's empire went to. So now notice some very important things. In 293 CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who was actually a cousin of Emperor Constantine, he split the Roman Empire in the administration of the Roman Empire into what were called the 2 legs of the empire, both Eastern and Western. This is because prior to the advent of electronic communications, the Roman Empire was so big it was considered largely considered ungovernable. So if someone attacked you, it'd be 2 weeks before you'd even find out that they'd attacked your far border. But what we're going to see here is we're going to see a pattern and progression. We're going to see that while the Western leg has its own issues, the Eastern leg of the empire is first going to turn into what's called the Byzantine Empire, and then it's going to become Islamic. So again, we take a look at the administrative division that was instituted by the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Some very interesting things show up. We see Rome and the Italian peninsula in the Western leg, and then we see Alexander the Great's former Macedonian Empire showing up in the Eastern leg. Now, this is very interesting because we'll also see in 330 CE, Emperor Constantine moved his capital from Rome to Byzantium, which was then called Constantinople. Today it's called Istanbul in Turkey, and today it's a Muslim capital. So if we take a look, we zoom in on Istanbul, or on what was then called Byzantium or Constantinople, what we see is there's a progression of religions. We see this going from Greek to Muslim. So first it was Roman Catholic in the days of Emperor Constantine. Then later, when the Western leg of the Roman Empire fell, then the Eastern leg of the Roman Empire began to be called the Byzantine Empire. And this is where we get the Greek Orthodox faith, or the Eastern Orthodox faith of today. It's a continuation of the original Roman Catholic faith. But because the large portions of the eastern leg were conquered, today Istanbul is a Muslim capital. It's located in Turkey. So Daniel 7 and verse 23, and thus he said, the fourth beast, Rome, shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms. And in fact, its influence is still felt today. It says, and it shall devour the whole earth. And in this context, we're probably talking about the globe. Trample it and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, as we saw before. In Daniel 2, they correspond to the 10 toes. They also correspond to the 10 supernations of the Club of Rome. But it says, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them, probably referring to the New World Order. And he shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. And again, 725, he, referring to the Pope, shall speak pompous words against the Most High, meaning he's going to contradict the things the Most High says. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change the festival times, meaning the Sabbath and festivals and the Torah. And the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and then times, and half a time. So with this understanding, with this background information, let's take a look again at Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14. It says, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, which her place of safety was in Protestant northwestern Europe, where she's nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent or the dragon. So in context, what this means is that the lost tribes made their march northward and westward, as documented in the works of Davidi and Collins. And then when the Roman legions brought the Catholic faith to Europe, the tribes in Protestant northwestern Europe were protected from the Catholic faith by virtue of the fact that they were at a distance from Rome. So continuing on in verse 15, it says, and the serpent spewed water. And we know water can represent the Spirit. And it can also represent doctrines or dogma. So in this case, it represents false doctrines. So and then the serpent spewed water or false doctrines out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, which in this case refers to the bride, Ephraim, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So what this is saying is that the dragon, Rome, is attempting to spew waters or spew different doctrines or dogmas out after the woman in order to sweep her away with this flood, meaning is trying to get her confused, trying to get her to keep her away from the original first century faith. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. We could talk on this for a long time, but we're going to cover this in much more detail, greater detail in the Torah government study. If you want to read ahead, you get the copy of the Torah government book, or you can read it on the website. So in the first century, we had Yeshua and his Nazarenes, and the Nazarene. One of the things that we know about this is that the Nazarenes, as we explain in the Torah government study, they had a unified priesthood. There was unified leadership. They also had a single doctrine which revolved around the Torah. They still believed Torah. Now, outside the land of Israel, the Catholic Church did some things right, other things wrong. But notice what we're going to see here. We talk about the great falling away. It wasn't a single-time event. So the Catholic Church also had a single doctrine, even though it didn't revolve around the Torah. They also had unified leadership, although it was oppressive leadership and not servant leadership. They also began to suffer a breakup with the division between the East and West legs of the empire. And then they had Eastern and Western patriarchates, which continues to this day. So the Western Roman Patriarch is the Pope in Rome, and then the Eastern Patriarch, there's differences, but we could talk about that later on, but that's where we get the Eastern Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox faiths at. Well, focusing on the Western leg, then we have, speaking about the Protestant breakaway, the bride, being nourished for a time, times and half a time. So once we had the Lutheran Church, then we began to get other churches. We had the Anabaptist, and then the Anglican, and then many other state-sponsored, state-run churches. And these Protestant churches, we effectively ended up with multiple bodies of Messiah, each one attempting to reestablish the original faith, but none of them quite making it. So we ended up with multiple doctrines, and then, of course, separate headquarters for those faiths. Then as time progresses, then we came to have independent or separate churches. We've got independent organizations. They have no relation, no affiliation. So you might have a pastor, but he doesn't, he may or may not know about the Torah. You're going to have individual leadership and assistant pastors, associate pastors. Then we come to a more modern, this is the last 10 or 20 years, we end up with what's called the house church phenomenon. And in Messianic circles, it's just Messianics getting together. But there's no organization. Everyone has their own individual doctrine, or you'll have a doctrine by family. And basically, it treats the individual consumer as, you might call his own ecclesiastical sovereign. And this is a necessary phase. When we get to the Torah government study, what we're going to see is that this is a necessary phase that the majority of Ephraim, the bulk of Ephraimites, have to go through. But that these are not the original faith, because the original faith was a unified faith with a single doctrine and a single priesthood. We'll talk more on that in the Torah government study. But so here is the dragon, effectively, with this slide, spewing out all of these false doctrines, and some of which derive from Rome. But until the bride comes all the way back to the original first century faith, effectively, she's still in Rome. So continuing on in Revelation 12 and verse 16. But notice it says, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth." And one of the things that we learn here, again, focusing on the fact that these reforms and things took place in places like England and Germany, places that were far away from Rome. What we see is that physical distance and separation from Rome provides a measure of safety. And we also believe that physical separation from the land of Israel during the time of Jacob's trouble will also provide a measure of safety. Continuing in verse 17, it says, "And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of Elohim and have the testimony of Yeshua Messiah." And these are those whom the dragon is most enraged with, is those who both keep the commandments of Elohim, or the Torah, but they also have the witness of Yeshua Messiah. So that is Revelation chapter 12. Please join us again for Revelation chapter 13, where we'll talk about the two beasts, one that arises out of the sea and the other that arises out of the land, and how they pertain to Trumpet 7. Shalom.